Welcome into another edition of the BlueWhite Tailgate Pawcast. Mike Gross of LNP, Frank Bodani of the York Daily Record, and Andrew Callista here for another week of Penn State sports and Penn State football, wrestling, basketball talk. Never a dull moment in the Nittany Lions universe, guys. New defensive coordinator Jim Knowles introduced to the media. We're going to talk Penn State wrestling. The voice of the Nittany Lions, Jeff Ironhead Byers, stops by, and we talk about some of the recent struggles with the Penn State basketball program. But we start with the headliner. Wrestling bumped to the back page for this week on the winter sports calendar as Jim Knowles is introduced as the defensive coordinator of the Nittany Lions. The first question to him at his introductory press conference: why Penn State? Why now? Here is Knowles.
Penn State, for me, growing up in inner city Philly, was the epitome of college football, you know, when I was a kid. And I was never talented enough to make it to Penn State as a player. But, you know, given the opportunity to do it now as a coach, you know, it's really where I want to be.
Sounds familiar. James Franklin as the quarterback at East Stroudsburg. I wanted to go to Penn State. I wasn't good enough, but two guys from Philadelphia, very similar sound bites. What do we make of Jim Knowles' first meeting of the Penn State beat?
First of all, he has kind of a professorial way about him, which I sort of like. It's a nice difference from a usual football coach. I think anyway. He has really pushed hard on the Pennsylvania angle and the Penn State angle and the Philadelphia angle as far as why he wanted that is really, and I think he's pretty eloquent about that. It's hard not to think that something was askew at Ohio State that made him want to leave. I mean, it's still hard to accept that. But he seems like a very articulate, thoughtful guy, and I was impressed with him.
Yeah, I would agree in all facets. And, you know, here's the thing. He gets a chance at his point in his career where it seems like he's pretty comfortable being a top assistant coach, not a head coach.
Yep, that's another thing.
Okay, so he gets a chance to, so-called come back to the area, but he's being paid as the highest assistant coach ever. And you got to believe he's going to have full control of the defense, which it just seems like something that could have really frustrated this kind of guy, no matter how many games Ohio State was winning or losing, because it's the process too, right? If you go to your job every day, no matter how well it ends up, if it's a struggle every day to do what you're doing in any capacity, I think he sees this as a really fulfilling, great opportunity. And has there been coordinators that have won back-to-back national titles or even played for them in consecutive years?
That's a really good point. To be clear, I don't think the struggle was coming from Ryan Day at Ohio State, because he's an offensive guy, and I'm sure, much like Franklin, he was happy to turn the whole thing over. It probably came from within the defensive staff, and this group at Penn State is a little bit younger, with the exception of Terry Smith, who is not going to be that guy who's going to create a struggle for him. It's a younger staff, and you could see that as part of it. I think that's a good call.
You mentioned, and Jim mentioned, he's flat out said it, I have no aspirations to become a head coach. In this day and age, it's kind of refreshing, and I think the Penn State fan base takes that as kind of refreshing. He comes in with Penn State's young staff on that defensive side of the ball. He's their head coach, and he's molding these guys as part of his coaching tree right there. And then Jim Knowles, he doesn't have that coaching tree per se as the head coach. But now you're going to see these guys branch off because Dan Connor's going to succeed in this business. Ironhead Byers is already succeeding. Depths wherever he goes. He's not going to be at Penn State forever.
I think that's Frank's point. That's probably part of it. That's something that I really didn't think about until Tuesday. But yeah, I think it's probably part of it.
Yeah, I think he sees. I think all these things give him an opportunity that he would not have maybe anywhere else. It's not just one thing. It's not just the money. It's not just being close to Philly. Gotta love how his stories about Philadelphia, right? Called himself a gutter snipe. What is a gutter snipe, actually? But okay, so I think it's all those things, though. It's all the things that you just mentioned. I think the assistant staff is a huge part of it because they're talented, but they want what's best for Penn State. I mean, that's the way the vibes we've gotten ever since those guys have been there. So it's all those things. I don't think he could match that anywhere else. And if from the outside looking in, if you could do away with all the crazy pressure that it seems like swirls around Ohio State, I'd want to get out of there as quick as possible.
Talk about some of the things when he was talking about Philly and growing up with. They asked about his connections to Penn State. Was he a fan of Penn State? And he referenced watching the Sunday morning highlight show. We had a George Paterno reference. It's been a while since I've heard a George Paterno reference, and then it was the pause, and we now move ahead due to time constraints later on in the third quarter. That was hilarious.
Here's a sobering thing that I thought while he was saying that. I'm 7 years older than him. He's 59. Man, he sounds like he's talking about back at the invention of television, and he's 7 years younger than I am. Boom.
Yeah. And for anybody out there, James Franklin and his assistants make more paternal reference and paternal family references than anybody in the administration. That's just a simple fact.
That would be like 2 references compared to 1 or 0. I'm not given. James doesn't bring up Joe a whole lot.
Yeah, I mean, James really avoids it, but I kind of noticed that too. I'm with you. That's and also the the cops are going to work and then coming to practice and rolling up their pants and wow, man,
there was some good stuff. Just overall impressions about how he handled that first press conference. Not that there were any landmines laid by the at this introductory press conference, but just overall because, he avoided saying anything really with off alarm bells in Columbus and things like that. And I thought it was interesting how he handled the question related to talking with Andy Coulter-Nittany, as we're already talking, as we see speculation swirling as the top 5 replacement list has been named for Ohio State's offensive coordinator.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too, and especially because I think it was you, Andrew, who noted this on a previous show that the trouble that Penn State has had scoring touchdowns against Ohio State the last 3 years under Jim Knowles. So I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are talking a lot. I thought he was very impressive. Again, I'm going to go back to really a thoughtful guy and sort of a quietly articulate guy. I just like the general feel of the guy.
Yeah. I mean, he comes in with all this renown and statistics and accomplishments. And I think you're viewing him, meeting him in that vein. And I think he upheld that, is that he just seemed in control. Seems like he knows exactly what he wants to do in this situation without drawing out schematics for us. Like, he knows what he's coming into. He knows what he's got to work with. He seems pretty impressed by that. And he seems pretty confident that, yeah, I think I can make the tweaks necessary for us to get back to where we were and do what we haven't.
You just look at the stat sheet, 16 games played, 972 opponent plays, 4,074 yards, 4.19 yards per play, just 23 offensive TDs, opponent TDs of total of 24, and 254.6 yards per play. Good for the number 1 total defense last year in the country. And Mike, Frank just teed you up for the question that you asked for the presser. What was your question? And then we're going to play the response.
I wanted to get him to kind of describe his defense, but also didn't want him to fall back on, well, we want to be aggressive and we want to be fundamentally sound and we want to play fast and we want to tackle well, which is what any football coach would say. And when I was going through that, he was sort of nodding, which I took to mean, well, he understands what I'm going here, and did not go X and O, but I thought he gave a pretty interesting answer.
Here is that answer right now.
I would think the first thing you're going to see is that we're going to have answers. That's the biggest thing to me, is to make sure that we have answers for the players to be able to succeed, to put them in the right positions, right? I mean, we've all watched football and you can see where there's a gaping hole or a busted coverage, and I never blame the players for that. I always take responsibility. If something happens negatively, the players know that in the game that's my responsibility.
That's Jim Knowles' answer. And he also went on to say that the players are not going to be exposed to the opponent's offensive coordinator or to the opponent's quarterback, and that there's enough disguise built into the defense so that our opponent doesn't know exactly what we're in. That's exciting. From a fan's perspective, that's exciting, and it sounds familiar to a certain defensive-minded coach who won a few championships at the University of Alabama.
Yeah, it's we've heard this from I think we heard this from Kotelnicki in so many words. We heard it from Moorhead in so many words. We want to dictate to the other guys. We don't want them to dictate to us. That's really the big picture of what he was saying. And Kotelnicki said the same thing. I mean, that's sort of the constant battle of football, maybe pre-snap, and then after that, it's athletes make plays.
Right. One of the things about his defense, I mentioned it before, I think that stands out to me, is the way they, despite the talent that he has, the way they came up big in the big moments and being able to instill maybe that, I don't know, mentality or whatever it is for them to do it. I mean, the goal line stand against Penn State, they had a goal line stand against Nebraska when they needed it, when the team was just not playing real well that day. Things could have gone real sideways, and his defense wouldn't let that happen. And against Texas in the semifinals, I mean, Texas was right there. Ohio State's defense comes up big. And I think that, to me, in some ways is the one thing Penn State has been missing with every coordinator they've had under James Franklin. No matter how much everybody loves to talk about their styles and Manny Diaz's hair, and no, maybe they don't, but is that Penn State's defense has not won them games when they needed it. And I think they've had the talent at times to do it. And I think that might be the last level for this defense, is in big moments to come up and help win a big game.
Well, a couple of things. They led the country in fewest yards given up per game and also fewest points given up per game. I don't see that combination very often. First in the country in both of those things, which suggests they're unbelievable in the red zone, but it's not a bend but not break thing. They're stopping people everywhere in the field. And I'm going to assert that Frank could only have brought up Manny Diaz's hair because he has picked up the slack in the hair area since Manny left.
At least that's what James thinks, right?
At the same time, that has been a little bit of a criticism of James in the past of style over substance. And I'm not saying that is relevant the last 5 years. Maybe it's more relevant the first 5 years. But listening to Jim Knowles, this is like, and just watching that press conference, this is like a football coach version of Teddy Roosevelt. Walk around and carry a big stick. Am I wrong? You guys are a little bit older. I'm not saying you're Teddy Roosevelt.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Like, that was more directed at you, not Frank's phenomenal hair. The persona and the way he answered the questions, just very soft spoken. It's different than Bob Shoop. I mean, Bob Shoop was talking a mile a minute. Brett Pry, a little bit more outspoken.
Tom Bradley was a fast talker. When they'd bring him in after games, man, he would be spewing the football, technical football jargon. But you said Franklin has been said to be style over substance. I think this guy is substance over style.
They don't need a whole lot on defense, but being able to hire what is now known as the top defensive coordinator, top defensive mind in the country, that alone changes things to me, the way you view Penn State. And I think the players at Ohio State seem to truly buy into what Jim Knowles was teaching. You can read quote after quote from how he made it easy for us to play fast, to I think it was JT comparing him to Batman coming out of the cave, not knowing what he's going to have, but always finding an answer, and you got to want to play with it under this guy. I mean, this is the top talent in the country saying this about Jim Knowles. So the assurance that you got maybe the best there is, I don't know Penn State's ever had that. And I think they've been increasingly close to winning. Big time.
Well,
and
Batman, I would say, is by the standards of superheroes, Batman is relatively substance over style.
Yes.
Look, can we get an introduction of the guest appearance?
No. That was a cameo. He's scoffing at my assertion about Batman, though, in the background.
One thing that jumped out to me is Jim Knowles' praise for the staff that was in place and the job that they have done. This isn't a shabby defense Jim Knowles is walking in to remake. This is a top 10 defense. They're number 7 in total defense in the country, according to the NCAA. I pull it up here. Yes, number 7 by last year's number. And Jim shouted that out. That being said, he did say he's coming in here to listen and kind of mold to what Penn State has and do some things. And he's going to have the control and he's going to change some things, but he's also coming in to learn what Penn State has. And that leads to questions on, well, what's the timeline going to be? Here's Jim Knowles on what the timeline is going to look like for these first couple months here and into the first season at Penn State.
Well, we're going to go at the pace of the players, right? I mean, always work with the assistants closely on that. Like, hey, I want A to Z and I want it in by the time spring ball starts. That's not going to happen, and then, the assistants, though, we had that talk today. Hey, you tell me if I start to put in too much that we need to dial back, So you need to get A right, then you go to B.
You could say that's all talk and that's just coach speak for an introductory press conference, but I sense no ego in that. And I go off of what he said about Dion, Dex, Dan Connor doing a great job, which I think based on that comment, we all assume that he's going to be promoted eventually, if it's not already official, to full-time linebackers coach at Penn State. But guys, I mean,
yeah, he made a sort of a related point to that, which made sense to me, which is Penn State has played pretty good defense under multiple coordinators, and some of those guys, Terry Smith is certainly one of them, have worked under multiple coordinators. So it would only make sense to me being Knowles to lean on those guys and give them some autonomy. That maybe that was a little bit of a sticking point at his previous stop.
Yeah, and I think he doesn't have as much, not that he ever had to rebuild anything at Ohio State, but they were struggling in some ways, even with a team on defense. So he had to go in and figure out what the disconnect was and change that to some degree. He doesn't really have to do any of that at Penn State, and I think he would appreciate that because they've performed, you can see it, but he also has a staff that seems to have continuity and just be in agreement that I think he believes he can work with these guys to do what work needs to be done. Like, he's confident in that, and that's a huge thing. And it makes sense.
Mike, just going off of your point, I think that's a huge tip of the hat to James Franklin, and something that he doesn't get enough of credit for is the success of the defense under multiple coordinators, and that goes into the hires that is he made down the assistant ranks and the culture that he's been able to promote there within the defense to be able to turn over the head men at the top.
You said it. The most important thing these guys, a head coach does, is recruit. The second most important is hire people to help him recruit and develop. And he's been good at both of those things. And I think that's particularly manifested itself on defense, especially because defense is so much about athleticism. And he has been really good at recruiting athletes and speed and that kind of thing.
Here's what I'll say. James Franklin gets an A for his consistency and his continuity as a coach. If you're looking at categories, to me, he's the best, because while they haven't achieved the ultimate, look at what he's been able to do. You mentioned the multiple coordinators, but he's been able to retain guys that normally you think might be gone and find guys within the system that could work or that have ties to Penn State. Look how successful Ty Howell's been. Look at Deion Barnes, the way he's progressed. He's kept Anthony Poindexter. He kept Brent Pry forever. And I think that matters. And look at how he deals with players. So while Penn State hasn't gone out and splashed money at transfers, look at the way he's been able to keep guys from not leaving and to get guys to come back and spend your money there and your resources there. And it's paying off, and it may pay off bigger than ever coming up. The consistency that he has might finally maybe be recognized, I think.
Frank, I want you to delve into your crystal ball. What do you see it? Because you just mentioned a big payoff. It could come sooner than later in the transfer portal after spring ball with Jim Knowles as Penn State's defensive coordinator. How do you see this spring season going? And if Penn State's missing a guy, are they able to go out, and is Jim Knowles able to go out and say, this is the guy I need for my defense, and they're able to go out and make this splash in a transfer portal now?
Well, yeah, I would think that Jim Knowles, one, has that ability to figure that out and ask for it and do it. And I think Penn State, the alignment, and come back to the alignment that Franklin talks about with Pat Kraft and the president, I think Penn State has the resources to make it happen if they feel like it's the right call. I mean, the spring window has typically been more narrow than the December window, where there's not as many options, but they did get Chop Robinson in the spring window. So there is going to be talent there. And it just feels like Penn State's never had a trouble identifying talent and what they need, but you always wondered if they were always able to maybe get it. And I think you have the personnel now and maybe the resources that it would not surprise me. I would almost expect them to bring in another impact wide receiver if possible, and like you just mentioned, somebody on defense that could help them right away. And whether that's edge rusher, a linebacker, what D-tackle, whatever.
The real short thing, Chop Robinson was a 5-star who went to Maryland. So arguably he went to a lower level than maybe most 5-stars would even look at. And then after a year, he decided that he wanted to be in a better situation. And that may be a simplistic read of it, but that's sort of the obvious read of it. That's the kind of guy that maybe they're going to have to get a receiver that's going to be a difference maker. Because a lot of the guys that decide that they're in the portal after spring practice are guys that have seen the handwriting on the wall in spring practice. So those may not be, those aren't, the first round pick type guys. But that's a thing. And here's another thing about this. Knowles he didn't emphasize this as much at Ohio State, but he was really known at Oklahoma State for this hybrid position that's kind of like a cross, but kind of like a defensive end and a linebacker. We often hear about a D-back and a linebacker. This is a defensive end and a linebacker. And when I was reading about that and thinking about that, I thought, well, gee, two recent Penn State players, Micah Parsons and Abdul Carter, who are gone now, were maybe the two most ideal guys in the recent history of college football for that role. So maybe you go out and try to find a guy like that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mike, you mentioned Maryland. Some Maryland boosters would like to have a word with you about that 5-star comment going south of the Mason-Dixon line.
I wrote a story last night about transgenders in sports, so I've had the gloves up for the last 24 hours.
We're going to stick to football, basketball, and wrestling on this one. So, speaking of wrestling, Jeff Ironhead Byers waiting in the wings for the listeners. He's coming up here on the BlueWhite Tailgate Pawcast. Penn State has 2 big bouts coming up, one against Michigan, one against those Terps at Rec Hall later on Sunday. They're coming off a big win against Iowa. Frank, 2 recruiting losses for Penn State as the 2 top guys in Pennsylvania head elsewhere. Both Bishop McCourt guys, ranked number 1 and number 2, pound for pound. One goes to Iowa, one goes to Oklahoma State. I don't think Penn State's panicking by any stretch of the imagination, but we're going to talk a little bit about, possibly an executive order to break up Penn State wrestling because it's been dominating so much with Jeff Ironhead Byers. Are things starting to change now with the money flowing around wrestling?
Well, I wrote about this today too, because I thought, well, people might be wondering what the heck is going on. But I think it's inevitable in some ways with Penn State's situation, because it goes beyond the fact that they could have their most balanced, most powerful team ever this year on top of everything else they've already done, right? It goes beyond that because the way it does is that they have basically an entire lineup and more of All-American / national champion contenders redshirting and waiting already on the roster. They only lose 3 starters from this team that could be one of the best. And most of the guys they return have multiple years. And they just got the top 2 guys in 2025. So my point is, at some point, you're going to have guys who they're going to be face of the program top talents, like these guys, right? Like Bo Bassett, who are not going to want to maybe just get in line behind everybody else when they have some other reason or connection to go somewhere else and be the guy right away. And maybe they're getting more money to do it, 1. Maybe they can wrestle earlier, 2. Maybe they have a connection like Bo Bassett loved Iowa forever and Spencer Lee. And, of course, Jax Forrest knew David Taylor from Penn State, right? So there's all those things together. Penn State can't get everybody. It's a weird kind of coincidence, just to me, more or less, that the 2 top guys in 1 week chose to go somewhere else from the same school in PA. But the bottom line is Penn State's going to be fine. And I think this is what has to happen. That's the nature of what's going on there. That's how good it is beyond even this team.
Yeah, it seems almost like there's an inevitability to a little bit of this. Wrestling, I don't know a lot about wrestling, but I do know that it's an individual sport and a team sport. So if you're a recruit like these 2 kids, you're not thinking, man, I'm going to have a great offensive line to block for me if I go to Penn State. There's nothing like that in wrestling. So that's a piece of it, I would think.
Mike, you've been around the Lancaster sports scene much longer than I have. And Frank, you've been around the District 3 sports scene much longer than I have. In my decade down here, I've always had a perception, mid-Penn wrestling out of the 3 areas that comprise District 3 has always been the top tier out of those 3, followed by the York Adams area and then the Lancaster Lebanon area. Even though it has some success, it trails off the other 2 leagues on that. So my question over to Mike and Frank, I'd like you to answer this too. Since Penn State has become this dominant power, have you noticed a difference in just the high school wrestling landscape pick up as Penn State has become dominant?
I have not. I think the last big public school in our area that was really a monster in wrestling was, remember the run that Central Dauphin had a few years back, or for 5 years or so, they were as good as anybody in Pennsylvania. We don't really have a Bishop McCourt in our area. We don't really have a Wyoming seminary type deal in our area. And it seems pretty cyclical among the big public schools. There's no, like Manheim Township, Hempfield, Cedar Crest, McCaskey. None of those are, you would describe as a wrestling power. I don't know why that is, but it just is. It just is.
I mean, I don't know how you quantify the growth of it, but I think having Cale Sanderson and Penn State's success nearby, I mean, it has an effect. I mean, there's more excitement. You can be within the top team in the state, the country, and one of the top teams in the world you're 2 hours from it, no matter where you live in Pennsylvania. And you can get to it and you can access it to some degree and you can watch it up close and you can probably go to camps where some of these wrestlers are going to be at. So it's got to influence it. And I think the point Mike's brought up about the team and the individual, that's what makes wrestling so unique. I mean, there's not a lot of sports that have that dynamic the way wrestling does. And I go back to, we haven't really had a dominant team in your program since Hanover. Small school was dominant for many years. But you have an individual wrestler, right, from our area, Chance Marsteller, who was one of the greatest wrestlers ever in high school, but he came from a high school that had no wrestling tradition in Kennerdale. And yet it didn't really matter in a way, right? Yeah. But, he lifted up that area's wrestling because of how good he was, because small kids saw it and got excited by it. And I think it's hard to maybe put your finger on it, but it's huge. That's why I think a big reason why Cale came here. He knew that if he comes to coach in the area that has the greatest high school wrestling altogether in the region, how is that going to help him do what he wants to do? Well, you see, because they're ready to win their 12th national title in 14 years. The best wrestling is in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Ohio. Cale's right there. The foundation is there, and Iowa can't bear to even try to keep up at this point. They're spending money everywhere on transfers. Who knows what they spent on Bo Bassett to come. And how is it going to matter, really, at this point? They're going to need more than that. And I'm not sure how you change that, because you could win matches with one or two wrestlers, but how are you going to overtake the team at this point? That's a good question to me. Because Mock Dynasty is what it is.
That number, I'm not going to throw what we've read out there. It's absurd. I'm not going to say it because it's not confirmed. Mike, you're going to hop off. We're going to talk to Jeff Ironhead Byers. And then when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about Penn State hoops. But first, Jeff Ironhead Byers joins the BlueWhite Tailgate Pawcast. We continue to talk Penn State wrestling here on the BlueWhite Tailgate Pawcast. And nobody better to do that. Maybe Cale Sanderson a little bit better, but we got the legendary voice of the Nittany Lion wrestling program, Jeff Ironhead Byers. Jeff, what is going on? What are you up to, man?
Just favorite time of the year is just around the corner, so just enjoying the ride right now.
You're not just the voice of the Nittany Lions. You got your own radio show. I want you to pump that. You're doing podcasts, everything. Let us know what's going on with you.
Yeah, the main things now, we've actually cut back a little bit on the podcast for the moment. So right now, I do a show in the State College area called Let's Talk, weekday mornings from 8 to 10 a.m. With my co-host, Scott Giese. And we talk certainly some local sports, but we also delve into other local and national issues and just, kind of a news talk show on a sports talk station. But we have a station that we started about a year and a half ago. Myself and a couple of other guys got together and got a station and decided we wanted to really fill what we felt was a huge void in the market with sports talk radio. And we have mostly local programming from p.m. till 6 p.m. weekdays. And then we're doing a lot of high school sports right now with high school boys and girls basketball and wrestling. And then we'll do baseball and softball coming up here in the spring.
That is some loaded stuff for the folks up there in Center County. When you talk about loaded, Penn State's wrestling lineup, that is loaded. Is this the best lineup you've ever seen with the Nittany Lions?
It's not only is the best lineup I've seen with the Nittany Lions, it's the best lineup that there's ever been in college wrestling. Now we'll see how this plays out. Obviously, where you really etch your place in history is in the postseason, which Cale's team's track record is pretty good here of managing that part of the season in very good fashion. But if this team does what I think it is capable of doing and what it's going to do, I think it will go down as the greatest team. And I don't think there will be really any real debate about it. I would argue last year's team to this point has been the greatest college wrestling team, but it's debatable. I mean, depends on the metrics you want to use. Minnesota obviously had the 10 All-Americans one year. Iowa had a couple of teams that would certainly be comparable to what Penn State had last year. I think if you go back to some of the Oklahoma State teams, you might have some teams that were comparable. But if this team does, and it's, a big if, but if this team does get 10 All-Americans, let's say at least 6 in the finals and sets the scoring record, I think it's going to be virtually impossible to argue for any other team in the history of the sport that would be better than this year's edition of the Nittany Lions.
Hey, Jeff, I got to ask you, tell me what makes this lineup the best one to you? Is there one or two things, for example, that make it better than last year, that make it better? You've seen tremendous lineups in Penn State wrestling teams. What's the difference to you with this one?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things. One is that there really, truly is no hole in the lineup. Again, as we're talking here, this week, Penn State has all 10 guys in the starting lineup ranked in the top 7. So it is very rare in the history of the sport that you see a lineup with 10 guys ranked, even in the top 15. Nationally, but to have all 10 inside of the top 8, obviously at the end of the year, earn All-America honors, to have all 10 guys ranked in the top 7, I don't think that's ever happened before. I haven't actually gone back and looked at the record books on that, but for a long time, again, even the teams that were at the top, there was almost always a weight where like, kind of a 500 guy or a so-so wrestler. And I think, that Minnesota team in 2001, which still lays claim to as the only team to have 10 All-Americans, the thing about that team, and it was a great team, emphasis on the word team, they had 10 guys that placed 3rd to 8th, which is tremendous. I mean, and arguably, again, right now you can say, well, that was the best team, top to bottom depth. What this year's edition of the Nittany Lions has is that top end firepower where you have, I would argue, 8 or 9, maybe even 10 legitimate all national title contenders. Where again, I think any of the 10 guys, and I'm not saying they're going to get 10 in the finals or certainly not 10 champions, but I think all 10 are within striking distance. And it wouldn't be absolutely shocking to see any of them in the finals. When you look at a Greg Kirklead or certainly a Carter Starachi, a Levi Haynes, a Mitchell Messenbrink, and you start there, it's like, okay, you have the top end firepower, then you have that depth throughout the course of the lineup, meaning top to bottom depth. But then the other thing this team has, and it really hasn't needed it because the starters have remained remarkably healthy to this point, but the depth in terms of the second and third guys behind the starters in the room at each weight. So I just think by any metric you use, this team is going to stack up better than any other. Again, they've not lost more than 2 bouts in any dual meet. If that holds up through the rest of the season, and I think it will, that is also unprecedented. Even the best of the Iowa teams, you had dual meets where you lost 3 or 4 bouts somewhere along the way. To run through a dual season and not lose more than 2 bouts in a single dual meet is just crazy.
Ironhead, you talk about that lineup, and I would not even have. Let me restart that. That was terrible by me. Jeff, you talk about that lineup and really not dropping more than 2 bouts in a dual meet. You know, the Department of Justice, they've broken up Apple. They've broken up or trying to break up Alphabet, Google. Does somebody have to step in here? Does the NCAA have to say? Because I've seen people saying it's getting boring watching Penn State just dominate this. Obviously, that's a little bit of exaggeration, but I mean, it's not totally unprecedented, but is this all good for the sport, having one team just absolutely dominate like Penn State's doing for these extended stretches?
Like, from Penn State's perspective, what do you want Cale to do, right? Like, you're supposed to purposely, all right, we won't take all of the guys that want to come here. We won't take the top recruits. So, Cale's job is to put out, and his coaching staff is to put out the best possible team they can. And so it's up to everybody else, right? And listen, Iowa used to say the same thing with Dan Gable. And Penn State was one of the teams trying to chase them down. And so I get the argument. We were making it. It's like, and nobody was saying Dan Gable shouldn't be doing, but it's like, man, this isn't good for the sport to just have one team that is almost guaranteed to win every year. At the end of the day, I think eventually the commitment was made by a bunch of other schools to, hey, we've got to go all in here. With the changing world of college athletics right now, I'm not sure how this is going to shake out. I think it's good for the sport that you have a program that wrestles as hard as Penn State does, with as much flair as Penn State does. I mean, I think it's a visually pleasing style of wrestling. So I think that is good. And I think you're seeing that because of the success Penn State is having. I do think you're seeing more kids at younger levels and more programs across the board preach hey, it's not just about winning. It's about, let's go get as many points as we can. So from that standpoint, I do think it is good for the sport. Again, I could probably argue either way at the end of the day, whether it's good to have a dynasty in any sport in terms of the overall interest and all of that. But listen, one of the things when you have, it's just like the Kansas City Chiefs here with the Super Bowl, people are tuning in because they want to see whether they can do this again. And they also want to see, hey, can the Eagles knock them off? So I do think there's, okay, now let's see, can Iowa do it? Can Oklahoma State with David Taylor, can somebody break through here and, end this reign, at least put a hiccup in it? And right now, the way Penn State is set up, I think it's going to be very difficult for somebody to break through, for another team to break through over the course of the next 4 or 5 years here anyway.
What do you see? I mean, there's many factors for the success and the domination, but is there something that you think plays into this that maybe people don't pick up on with either Cale or the way the programs run? Is there a factor there, an ingredient that you think maybe gets overlooked to help explain the success, the domination?
I think the mindset that Penn State has is pretty unique in the sport because what they do, wrestling is very important to them. Trying to win is certainly, obviously, the goal. But the focus, and it really is, every day, it is just, hey, how can we become better wrestlers? And I think the other thing they have is kind of the big picture perspective where, while, again, wrestling is very important and they want to win, none of these guys are defining themselves by the sport. They all recognize that there are bigger things down the road in life and with their purpose than wrestling. And what I think that allows them to do is wrestle more freely than what you would expect in tight pressure situations, because they don't feel like this is do or die, or man, I have to win this or my legacy is not going to be what I want it to be. It's, hey, this is so cool. I have the opportunity to go try to win a national championship, to be part of this really special program and be around these really special people. And I'm going to do everything I can to go win it. And at the end of the day, if I don't, shake hands and I'll go on. There's bigger and better things around the corner. It's just a different mindset than what I've ever seen in the sport.
I think the mindset, and we talked about it last week on the show when we were just making predictions, is Penn State, you mentioned the scoring, they just go out and they just wrestle to keep scoring. Not every school does that, and I feel like that's what has set Penn State apart since Cale has arrived. Kind of dovetailing off of Frank's question, when you look back at kind of what's built this dynasty and important moments, obviously there's big moments at Madison Square Garden. There's Bo Nickel against Miles Martin and the hip toss straight to the back when he's in trouble. There's the David Taylor moments, Ed Roos moments. A couple moments that stick out for me that maybe are underrated. Quentin Wright. I mean, I just feel like he has such a forgotten role in building of this dynasty. And he's a local kid from Bald Eagle area. What role did he have in building and establishing this program for the first go around of championships to put Penn State on the map that say, yes, Cale Sanderson is going to be successful at Penn State?
Yeah, it's funny that you bring him up, because we were just talking this week when Tyler Kasak raised his fist there and had the win over Ja'Cory Teamer about some of the great moments, the singular moments, and kind of those pictures that you'll remember from this Cale Sanderson era. And for me, I mean, it's still the most iconic is Cale, getting ready to hit the mat there when Quentin Wright is spinning Grant Gambrell from Iowa. And that really was what kickstarted the dynasty here. So, yeah, Quentin Wright's role is huge. I mean, he was the first national champion on a national championship team for Cale Sanderson. And so, you only get one opportunity to be the first. And so to me, Quentin's role in all of this is set in stone, because again, he was the one that got this started, and his success, his individual success in that 2011 tournament was the key to Penn State getting that first championship. And obviously, I think will forever be associated, at least for me, with aside from the coaching staff, obviously, and Cale, Casey, and Cody were the difference makers. But Quentin Wright staying here and taking the strides that he did right out of the gate, and then obviously David Taylor following Cale Sanderson, never went to Iowa State, but had been planning to do that. And then when Cale came here, David's decision to was obviously critical as well. But those two, to me, if you're looking from a wrestler standpoint, the two guys that really got this thing rolling, it was Quentin Wright and David.
The moment, a lot of people were at that meet against Iowa, and they saw another domination. But Tyler Kasic's performance and that ending, was that pretty? I mean, it seemed special to me with what he did, how he did it. How would you describe what Tyler was able to do at the end of that match, the way he won it, and what maybe that says about this team? Did he show something we didn't already know?
Well, I think there were a couple of things. One thing that I think is going maybe a little underappreciated about that ending is Tyler Kasak gets Teamer up in the air with about 10 to 15 seconds still left in the match. And from a tactical standpoint, it was brilliant that Kasak didn't try to finish off that takedown, didn't bring him to the mat, Ja'Cory Teamer is a really dangerous wrestler. And we've seen over the years lots of situations where a guy gets somebody up in the air like that and then ends up getting scored on as they try to bring the guy down to the mat. And Teamer has great hips, great defensive wrestler. So just from a strategic standpoint, once he gets him up in the air, just keeping him there and allowing the time to run down and expire, it was actually a brilliant strategic move from Tyler Kasak to preserve the victory. And yeah, the raising of the fist and having the blood from the ref is an iconic picture, and it is right up there with one of the great moments, certainly in regular season history, and probably just in the history of Penn State wrestling. I mean, that image is going to be remembered for a long, long time, probably for a lifetime, for the fans that were there that night. It's one of those moments where, certainly for the wrestler, very special. Being able to knock off a number one guy, a four-time All-American, and do it in your home arena with 16,000 or darn close to it watching. I mean, that's special stuff for him. But I think for the fans, that would be the moment you remember out of the night. I think fairly close second would be Shane Van Ness and his performance against Kyle Parko, who is obviously an outstanding talent in his own right, and Van Ness just got it rolling there at the end of the second period and was able to ride the wave of the momentum and the energy of the building into the major decision then by the end of the third.
You see, Andrew, there is still exciting new ground to break here with Penn State wrestling. This isn't just boring.
No executive orders yet. But no hot. Not on the Penn State wrestling front. I'll put a word and make sure that doesn't happen. Looking ahead, obviously a lot has to happen before March. Madness coming. I love it. Kirkfleet, Stevenson. Just even thinking about that. I've seen people saying, hey, Greg has it. It's his moment to shine. How excited would you be to call a match like that?
I think it's going to happen. I think probably both at Big Tens and at Nationals. And I'm not sure anybody can beat Stevenson, but if somebody can, I do think Kirkfleet is that person. And I have been very impressed the couple of times I've been able to watch Stevenson this season. It does not look to me like he has any rust. I thought maybe, we'd see him still look very good, but not maybe quite where he was when we last saw him on a collegiate mat with all of the other things he's done and gone on and had some success with and maybe getting away from the sport. If he does have rust, boy, it has not shown in the matches I've watched him. But Greg Kirkfleet has a lot of history with him, going all the way back to high school, has had some success way back, admittedly. But I do think in the back of your mind, hey, I have defeated this guy. And I don't think there's going to be any intimidation factor there from Kirkfleet's standpoint. Now, I think he'll keep it close. Whether or not he can win again, that's going to be the fun of watching this thing. I certainly don't rule it out, and I think Ray Kirkfleet is certainly a better wrestler now than the last time he wrestled Stevenson a few years ago. But from what I've seen, I think Stevenson's actually a better wrestler as well. And again, I think it would be a whole lot of fun, and I think we're going to get to see it twice. And regardless of what happens in the Big Ten finals, I think that NCAA finals is going to be even more compelling and intriguing. So I think the potential for exciting matchups all over the place. Tyler Kasak and Meyer Shapiro from Cornell could be a fascinating match, and obviously Ja'Cory Teamer is still very much in the mix there. And there's a couple of other guys that I think could work their way into the title contention there at 157. So, I think just about every wrestler for Penn State, again, has a path to doing something really special at Nationals, but has at least a significant hurdle or two that could get in their way.
Jeff, what is there something about Kale that has continued to impress you beyond what we see? I mean, is there some aspect of how he goes about running this team to keep the continuity such a high level that maybe people just don't appreciate or don't understand? Something about him.
I mean, one of the reasons that they have been able to establish the dynasty is there is truly a constant evaluation of what can we do better? What do we need to do to help our wrestlers be more successful, to have more opportunities to go out and score points at an even higher success rate. So while I think most competitors are measuring themselves against their competition, Kale, I don't think, has ever done that. And I don't think he's ever asked his wrestlers to do. Well, I know he hasn't asked his wrestlers to do that. What he is asking them to do is truly look at yourself, where you're at today, and do everything you can to make yourself a little better today, so that when you step on the mat tomorrow, you're going to be a little better version of yourself. And again, it's a complete picture type of thing. So, these guys recruit the highest, they do the best job of recruiting in the country. I think technically they are the best coaching staff. I think they pick up on little things, how to change a grip here, how to, just move to one side or the other a little bit to make this a little easier takedown or opportunity to get back points. All of that, I think technically they are as good as it gets, but then they do all of the little things. Hey, what can we do to improve the sleep habits of our student athletes? What can we do to make sure they're getting the right diet so that when it's time to compete, their energy level is at its highest? What can we do to help with the mental health component? It is as comprehensive an approach as you could possibly imagine. And on top of all of that, they let these guys be themselves. So it's, you're not coming in here and, man, it's nice that you did that in high school, but the way we do it here, that's not the way it's done. It's, oh, this is working for you. Cool. Let's keep enhancing that. And let's maybe add this to your game. Let's improve the defensive elements here. So again, it is comprehensive, and they just do everything as well, if not better, than anybody else out there. And again, if you're starting with the best talent, you're coaching them up better than anybody else. And again, you're providing all of the possible support structures that are available to them. Again, you have a recipe to be extremely successful and virtually unbeatable. And right now, this season, I think that's where this program is.
We talked so much Penn State wrestling. We didn't even get to Carter Sirachi. That's a whole 1 hour podcast in and of itself. I mean, he's wonderful. I've had the pleasure of talking to him twice, doing camps down here in the area. He's wonderful. Aaron Brooks in the past, wonderful. That's what's always struck me about Penn State wrestlers is they're doing camps in Lebanon and around this state, not at these high-powered high school wrestling programs, but the way they interact with kids. That's always struck me.
Yeah, and listen, it is genuine. Andrew, we have missed flights. Well, we have held up flights. Missed flights. We have held up flights because Kale and or wrestlers will not leave an arena without signing any autograph requests that they see. I mean, they acknowledge everybody and they recognize the need for the goodwill for the sport. And that is another thing with these guys, that there is a genuine gratitude. I mean, I know it's a theme that is often associated with Penn State wrestling, but that gratitude is gratitude for having young people want to get your autograph, to looking up to you. And I think they look at that a little bit as a responsibility that, yeah, I have a responsibility to give back to these young people, but also, man, to genuinely be grateful that you're in a position that your hard work is now being looked up to by young people, and that's a potential path now for them to find success. And I think they see a genuine reward in that, and it's why they do acknowledge again and are so good in working with kids and providing autographs and all of that stuff. And I think that gratitude component is another big part of the success story of Penn State wrestling.
I can't let you go because I did the Penn State football post-game radio show with you on a prior station in a prior life of mine. You're my press box buddy. I sit next to you up there, and I nominated you under a previous administration that Coach James Franklin often references about buying in and stuff like that to be the deputy director of athletics from Fireworks. That nomination didn't go through at the time, but has Penn State football and under the leadership of Pat Kraft and James Franklin and this board of trustees, have they turned that corner in your mind with the recent moves with Jim Knowles coming over from Ohio State?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. And I think Pat Kraft is one of these guys that is just driven to provide those opportunities. Again, Cal talks all the time about, hey, it's up to the wrestlers. Like, we will do everything we can, but at the end of the day, the wrestlers have to decide how much they're willing to invest and what they want to get from it. And I think Pat Kraft is willing to go to the mat and provide every opportunity for his coaches and then the student athletes under those coaches to succeed. And I think the expectation is, hey, if we provide this to you, we ought to be going out and winning championships. And, winning championships are hard. It's not a given. You can do everything right, have everything in place, and it still not work out. But if you don't have everything in place, if you're not providing those opportunities, then you don't even have the chance. There's no question. Penn State next year is all in on trying to win a national title. Now, I think Texas is all in. I think Oregon is all in. So, again, the fact that they're all in, but boy, it sure feels like everything is in place for next season to be a really, really special year for Penn State football.
I want to thank you very much for joining the show. Folks, you could catch Jeff Ironhead Byers on the Penn State Radio Network, as he calls Penn State wrestling matches all season long, and also on a multitude of podcasts and radio shows up in State College. Also with Keith Goon Conlon, a prior guest on the BlueWhite Tailgate Pawcast. And I failed to mention Penn State legendary walk-on under Coach Joe Paterno, Jeff Ironhead Byers.
That's right.
Jeff, thanks a lot. Really awesome. Again, want to thank Jeff Byers for stopping by the show. Always great to hear from Ironhead. Talking a little bit now, Penn State basketball continues to be a struggle for the Nittany Lions as they drop another one in the Big Ten to Minnesota. Guys, this was a game that, as it played out, you're saying Penn State's playing, they're right there, have a lead in the second half, and then all of a sudden Minnesota goes on a run. Penn State ends up dropping another one. Maybe the best thing that could happen right now as these struggles continue is they have a couple days off and they're getting out of town for their West Coast trip to USC and UCLA. Mike, what is up with the Penn State basketball program that you've been able to see right now?
I think I believe it was, if they lost 9 out of 10 of those losses, whatever it is. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But of those losses, only 2 of them were really, not even blowouts, but just games that were close late. They look to me like a program that has lost confidence now. It looks like it's going to be very difficult for them to even make the Big Ten tournament, much less the NCAA tournament. That's almost out the window now unless they would get in the Big Ten tournament and win it. You know, I know Mike Rhodes enough to know that he's just got this down to be killing him, especially losing all these close games. And you know, you have the point guard. What I think you don't have is a guy that you can go to down the stretch and say, this guy can get a shot. This guy can score when we need a basket. And that's why they've lost so many close games. You know, they were never going to, you know, run the table in the Big Ten. But again, I think I said this a couple weeks ago, the 2 recruits that they have coming in next year, if they are close to as advertised, would have really addressed needs on this current team. Unfortunately, they're not going to be on the current team. But yeah, it's hard to spin Penn State basketball right now as anything other than kind of grim.
Andrew, you know what? I'll compare this to the 2004 Penn State football team because they were close in literally every game now, and they couldn't find a way to win. I mean, they didn't have enough offense, but they could not find a way to win, and they literally did about the same thing football-wise. Lost like, 6-7 games in a row, and they were in every single one. And when you lose every game close, you have a structure there in place, but you're missing that something. And I think like basketball, they're just a little short yet, like Mike mentioned, on the overall talent, that if everything doesn't go right, you don't have enough bodies that Mike Rhodes wants yet. But he's getting those recruits, and I think like Penn State football in 04 to 05, they brought in a couple young guys the next year. It made the difference. They won a couple games, which this team needs to just find a way to get that confidence, that spark, and it's gonna be a different story possible next year.
I don't want to. I'm sorry, Andrew. I just want to say Mike Rhodes is a big advocate of pressure defense. 94 feet, almost a Patino style from back in the day. And you can't do that when you're a little beat up physically and when you don't have quite enough depth, when you're short a little bit of players. So that's a big piece of it too.
Yeah, 8 of 9 by my count that they've lost. Again, math isn't my strongest suit here as I'm looking at on my computer screen, but a 1-point loss to Oregon at home, who was ranked, when Penn State's missing their best player.
Yeah, that's what we think about that. Yeah.
They win that game, we might be talking about a whole different mindset to get the confidence rolling. They are right in on the road at the toughest place to play in the Big Ten at Michigan State. They dropped that game by 5 to Michigan State at the Breslin Center. They come back home. They get a win over Rutgers after dropping one early in the season. A 1-point loss on the road to Iowa. Probably should have won that. A 4-point loss to Michigan, a game they let slip away. It's a perfect analogy to the 2004 Penn State football team. That game in particular, Michigan ranked. The low point, I think, is the last 2 games against Ohio State, the return to rec. It seemed like the team gave up in the second half. I don't want to use the term quit, but it seemed like they gave up. And then the second half against Minnesota was just not good, just not able to generate offense or generate open shots enough to be able to score. And that's a problem. Hopefully is addressed.
And Minnesota's a team that if Penn State's going to have a good year, Minnesota's a team they have to beat. Yeah. Iowa's probably a team. Iowa this year is probably a team they have to beat. Yeah, it almost feels like, you hate to say playing out the string at this point, but man, there's every game in the league is deep enough that it's hard to imagine them going on the kind of a run that they would need to do this late in the regular season to turn it around.
That being said, every game looks winnable. Literally, this team has proven that they could beat a top-ranked team as they pummeled Purdue and has played other top-ranked teams very close.
Yeah. Think about what they did to Purdue. That's the high point for sure. Yeah.
But that's pretty much what the state of Penn State basketball. I implore everyone to hang in there with Coach Rose. The reinforcements are on the way with next year's recruiting class. And again, hopefully this a couple days off and a trip to the West Coast could kind of reinvigorate kind of the leadership. And leadership, I feel like, is lacking right now. Somebody needs to step up and take the bull by the horns to get them back on the winning path. Anything that we missed that you guys want to talk about and cover here?
You need a prediction, at least from you guys, who are probably way more Philadelphia fans than myself. How many yards is Saquon going to rip the Chiefs for on Sunday?
How many late flags will come out for offensive hold?
Okay.
They don't hold. They have the best offensive line in the nation, right?
They played the Chiefs yet this year?
No, I think Saquon's going to be great. I think he is great, and he will be great. I think that's because of that offensive line. So I'll say 120. I think it's more important how the yards come than the total.
Right.
I think that's more important. I'm surprised how many people in the punditocracy are picking the Chiefs. I think the Eagles are the better team, and the argument for the Chiefs is sort of, well, they got Patrick Mahomes and he'll just figure it out. Well,
but until you cut the head off the snake, it's like you try to kill the thing, man. You just can't kill that. They're becoming one of those teams like Tom Brady, and we can name others that it just feels like it's hard to stomp them down. And I think Philadelphia is the hotter team, the better team. But I think there's doubt, right? Until you do it, until they beat them, until you beat the Chiefs in this game, you got to.
But I would also say there's a little bit of psychology that's in their favor too, because I think that things like this trying to win 3 in a row, be the first team to win 3 in a row, we have a chance to do something that nobody's ever done. I mean, if you're gonna be amateur psychologists, I think that plays into it a little bit as an advantage for the Eagles in my mind. And I noticed that I was thinking that, and then I saw Eli Manning said the same thing the other day. And if you remember, he was the quarterback of that Giants team that beat the Patriots, who were going for that undefeated season. And that the Eagles are way better compared to the Chiefs than that Giants team was compared to that Patriots team. But they found a way.
I think Saquon's going to go for more than 130. I think there's going to be a big chunk play of 35, 40 more that he's able to rip off. And I think that the psychology point, Mike, you kind of took it right out, is the difference between like those Patriots teams that were going is they always had to like get rid of their opponent. It seemed early, like with the Colts and like Peyton Manning, like kind of early.
Well, that Patriot team that year was absolutely dominant.
Yeah, it was earlier in the playoffs. And the Eagles, they have that motivation. Like, do the Eagles win that Super Bowl against the Chiefs if Hurts doesn't fumble? Like, he didn't play a great game. Like, there's a psychological thing that of a revenge factor, knowing that we didn't play well and we're there right there at the end if that holding penalty doesn't get called, to win this football game. Because I don't think the Eagles played well in that Super Bowl. I don't think a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't think they did either. I think they're a little better now, and I don't think our beats are quite as good now. Look, I mean, it would not surprise me at all if either of these teams won. The spread is 1.5. That makes perfect sense to me. That's what it ought to be. This is a great matchup. I think I'm looking forward to watching the game. But I'm just a little surprised at the extent to which the predictions seem to be pro Chiefs.
I'm taking the Eagles. And that's not a homer pick because I'm a Steelers fan. I hate the song. I don't hate it. I get sick of hearing it, but I'm picking the Eagles on this. So
absolutely. I think the biggest worry is Saquon not just playing well, but those big runs. I mean, and if
that's what I meant when I said,
yeah, if he can't, I think he needs to cash 1 or 2 of them into a touchdown. You do not want to get in this game. If he does that, I don't think you want to get where you're down, caught at the 10 or the 5 and have to then earn your way in. Yeah, he has the ability to take it all the way, and I think he's got to cash in one, if not both of those big runs for them to be able to comfortably do what they should, which is win the Super Bowl.
When's the last time any NFL team reliably got those kind of plays from the running game?
I don't know.
Right? Yeah.
Like college. It's like you're looking at a college game.
I mean, maybe the Chargers with Lanning and Tomlinson. I mean, let's go back a while.
Yeah, he was a big play guy. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Guys, great show. We'll see you next week. Thanks a lot for listening to the Blue White Tailgate Podcast. Have a great one.